I stepped out onto the deck that morning, still in my socks, the boards cold against my feet, and saw the garden bed had changed. The wood chips were pushed outward in a loose circle right where I had knelt in the dream. A white, waxy smear ran across the center and onto two of the deck beams, thick in places and thin in others, like something pressed flat and left to set. I picked up a single chip and turned it in my fingers. The stuff clung without running, and when I rubbed a little between my thumb and forefinger, it worked into the skin the way hand cream does, only it left nothing greasy behind and carried no smell at all. I stood there longer than I meant to, trying to place when anything could have been spilled. Nothing came to mind. My wife was still asleep, and I knew we had not used any product like that the day before. I put the chip in a small jar without wiping it, and set the rest back the way I had found them. When she came out later, I showed her the patch. She looked at it for a long time without speaking, then said she had not noticed it the afternoon before.
We both stood there with the same quiet between us. It had started weeks earlier with the binoculars. Winter came in hard that year, so I waited until after dark when the cold settled and pulled a chair just past the reach of the porch light. Most nights I simply sat with the glasses and let my eyes adjust. Planes moved through in steady lines. Satellites crossed slow and steady, and now and then a meteor scratched the dark and vanished. I kept at it because stopping felt like giving up too soon. After a few nights, the light appeared. It held the same brightness as the stars around it, and stayed fixed in place. Every 11 seconds it dimmed and returned, regular as a clock. I counted it on my phone the first time, then stopped counting because the interval never shifted. Some nights it sat in one part of the sky, other nights in another, but it never drifted while I watched. I posted what I had seen, and a man wrote to me privately. He said he had noticed the same steady pulse for years, and that keeping an intention in mind might bring more of it. He did not explain what he meant by more, and I did not press him.
The light stayed reliable. Once or twice, its color shifted, by a shade I could not name. Nothing dramatic, only enough to notice against the others. I began to feel watched in a way that made the back of my neck tight. Not fear exactly, just the sense of being small under something that had lifted the cover. My wife had already told me she wanted no part of whatever might come closer, so after 2 weeks I set the binoculars aside on the nights I usually watched. The light did not appear when I checked. 3 days later the dream came. I was on my hands and knees in the garden in the middle of the night, the wood chips cold under my knees, and I was sick. When it passed, I stood and looked up. The moon was full and the air felt thin against my skin. I walked back to the house without turning around and went inside to bed. When I woke, the sheets were warm and my wife had not stirred. I lay there trying to decide whether any of it had been real enough to check. I went out before she woke.
The circle in the wood chips was already there, and the white smear covered the center exactly where I had been in the dream. I lifted another chip and watched the substance thin under my thumb the same way it had in the dark. It left no mark on the skin and no taste when I touched it to my tongue. I kept that one chip and put the others back where they lay. When my wife came out, she studied the patch the way a person studies something that should not be where it is. We checked the deck and the beds and found nothing we could remember using. She had been in the garden the afternoon before and would have seen it. After that, I left the sky alone. The night stayed clear, but I did not bring the chair out again or set any intention toward what might be listening. The piece of wood chip stayed in its jar on a shelf, and over time the smear dried and lost its thickness until it was only a faint film against the grain. I still take it down now and then and turn it under the light, though I have not decided whether I want to know more than I already do.
I parked across the freeway from the runway lights at Hill, right where the Northrop buildings sit dark against the Wasatch foothills. The astronomy binoculars rested steady on the roof of the car. Twilight still held a little blue in the west, enough to keep the shapes from washing out completely. One bright stationary light hung above the far end of the strip, higher than the usual drone traffic. I had watched that same position night after night, always unmoving until the small hours. The air felt cool against my hands, and the faint smell of jet fuel drifted from the base. I kept shifting my weight to stay comfortable, while the light stayed fixed, brighter than any of the drones I had grown used to seeing spaced out every 10 miles or so. A second light flared just south of it. I swung the lenses, and the shape snapped into view. Silver metal skin, no rivets or seams I could pick out, and a narrow band of colored lights running around the rim. Each color lit in sequence, red to green to blue, and back again, steady as runway strobes yet clearly part of the craft itself. It hovered without the slightest drift, lower than the first light but still well above the runway.
My breath caught for a second at how sharply the metal caught what was left of the daylight. It began to slide west. Every few seconds, the silver shape vanished and a low, ragged cloud took its place. The cloud would lurch forward 20 or 30 degrees of sky in an instant. Then the saucer would reappear on the far side of that jump, still holding the same altitude. I tracked it over the dark water toward Antelope Island until the last of the daylight faded and the object looked like nothing more than another star. The jumps left no sound, only the quiet sense that distance was folding in ways it should not. Two of the larger drones passed within a mile of it, heading south, never slowing or turning. 5 minutes later, the saucer cut north, swung once around a bright star at roughly the same height, then circled it a second time before continuing on. That was when the rest of the aircraft woke up. I counted 13 separate lights lifting and streaking north inside the next 3 minutes. The usual stationary drone above my place joined them. Somewhere behind the ridgeline I heard the low chopping sound of heavy helicopters, though I never caught their running lights.
My shoulders tightened at the sudden coordinated rush, the way everything below seemed to answer the saucer's movement without ever closing in. Jets stayed on the ground the whole time. The drones that had gone north began drifting back south about half an hour later, settling into their regular spacing again. Before I packed up, I took one last look at the star the saucer had circled. It carried the same color band around its middle, faint but unmistakable through the binoculars. 15 minutes after that, it split. 2 green streaks peeled away from the single point and ran west fast enough to leave short trails across the darker sky. The trails faded quickly, leaving only the ordinary scatter of lights above the lake. Within an hour, the usual mix of air traffic had returned, and nothing else moved out of pattern. I stayed a little longer, hands still on the binoculars, listening to the quiet settle back over the water and the foothills.
The next evening, my sister asked if I planned to watch the sky again. I told her I was worn out and meant to turn in early. Around 9:30, the tiredness came on fast while I sat with a book. The words on the page blurred and I kept jerking my head up after losing the line. I said it out loud, that the feeling was like being drugged, heavier than ordinary sleep and pulling harder at my eyelids no matter how I tried to push back. My cat would not look away. She stayed on the arm of the chair and stared without blinking as if she needed me to understand something I could no longer reach. When I stood for a glass of water, I had to catch myself against the wall on the way back. I gave up after that and went to bed. My sister had stayed outside in the camping trailer. She needed the bathroom later and crossed the yard toward the house. The moon was near full, yet the light seemed thinned out, as if something were holding it back from the fences and the grass. Every neighbor house stayed dark. No porch lights, no windows lit, and no sound of dogs or cars from the street. She had taken only a few steps when she stopped. My house carried a glow that made the siding look lit from inside the walls themselves. It was not a lamp or any porch light she could name. She said the whole place looked radioactive, the light pushing outward without a clear source. A tall figure stood against the shed, leaning there as though it had been waiting. When it turned, she saw the face clearly enough to know it was wrong. The shape was humanoid and nearly 8 feet high, but the eyes sat at an angle that belonged to something feline, and the line of the jaw carried the same pulled look. She turned around at once and went back to the trailer. She stayed inside until morning. When she told me the next day, the tiredness made a different kind of sense. one I did not want to hold for long. The cat had known before either of us. I still do not know what any of it meant. I do not know whether the feeling in my body or the figure by the shed were connected to what we had seen the night before.
I only know the pieces sit together in a way that leaves me uneasy when the house is quiet, and I cannot say whether any of it points to an attempted abduction or simply stands alone.
My son and I had taken opposite ends of the sectional that night because the air conditioner was still broken and we wanted the breeze through the windows. I said my usual prayers before I settled in, the ones I say every night, and then I added the part I had started saying lately for the ones that never answered back. I asked if they were lonely. I asked if they wanted company for a while, if that would help. I told them they were welcome to rest there if they needed it. After my boy fell asleep, I got up and closed the window because I thought I heard something moving on the roof again. Then I lay back down and drifted off. He woke first. We were in the car heading to the store when he told me. His voice was quiet, like he was just mentioning something he had seen on the way to school. He said an alien had stood beside me while I slept. It was thin, about his height, with a head that stretched out sideways and eyes that sat on the sides and looked puffy or swollen where they were. It had not looked at him.
It stood there watching the picture of the rabbit that hangs on the wall above the couch. He said it knew he was awake, but it never turned its head toward him. I kept both hands on the wheel and asked him if he had been scared. He said no. He said it did not feel like it wanted to hurt anything. It just stood there looking at the picture until he got up to use the bathroom, and when he came back it was gone. The doors had all been locked from the inside. The windows were shut. Nothing had been moved or opened that I could see when I checked later. He does not make things up. He does not have nightmares or invisible friends or any of that. When he tells me something he saw, he tells it plain and then he goes back to whatever he was doing. That morning he went right back to watching the houses go by out the window like he had just told me the mail had come. I asked him again about the eyes and he said they looked like they were pushed out a little from the sides of the head. Not angry or anything, just there.
He said the head was long across, not tall like the ones in movies. More like it went left to right. We drove the rest of the way without saying much else about it. I kept thinking about how still he said it had been, just standing there with that sideways head turned toward the rabbit picture like it had all the time it needed. The rest of the house was quiet when we got home, nothing out of place. The picture still hanging where it always does. I have not opened those windows again at night since then.
I was in bed when I noticed it standing there under the ceiling fan. It looked like smoke that had pulled itself together into a shape. Thicker than vapor, but still nothing solid. Gray and quiet in the low light of the room. I had already walked through that spot earlier without knowing, and the thought sat with me that I might have done it more than once, passing straight through whatever held it there. There was no way to touch it or hold on to anything about it. The whole thing just held its place beside the bed, facing the wall, and I stayed very still, trying to make sense of how something could be both there and not there at the same time. What I saw clearest were the eyes. They were large and set straight ahead, not turned toward me at all. That alone kept me from losing hold of myself. They terrified me even from the side, wide and steady, and I was thankful they never moved my way. Right then a thought came through that I was safe, and that whatever was happening sat outside anything I could steer. The feeling arrived with the words, calm and steady, like it had been placed there on purpose.
It gave the sense of standing guard, not looking for anything, just keeping its place, for reasons that did not need my say-so. I understood it was not alone even though I saw only this one, and the knowing arrived the same way the calm did, without sound. It had chosen to show itself, and that choice carried a weight I could feel pressing down on the air between us. It began to move forward past the foot of the bed. There were no legs or limbs I could make out, just a shape drifting ahead like it knew the way, adjusting itself slightly as it went, as if it could stretch or gather to fit the space. The movement was slow and certain. It passed the door frame into the bathroom and was gone. The whole thing lasted maybe half a minute once I really saw it. I stayed where I was, waiting to see if anything else would happen. But the room stayed quiet and the ceiling fan kept turning its slow circles above the empty spot. After that night, the small things that had been happening around the house tapered off. No more odd sounds at odd hours. No more sense that something was just out of sight.
We moved 6 months later and nothing like it showed up in the new place. I still think about the size of what it seemed to know, the way it could settle a person down without ever turning its head. It felt like more was there than just the one I saw, though I never laid eyes on the rest. The relief that came with its message stayed with me longer than the fear, though both felt just as real in the dark. I kept wondering what it had been protecting, and why it had let me see even that much.
I was 5 or 6. In a small bedroom with the kind of thin curtains that never quite kept the street light out. It was 1990 or 1991. I had gone to sleep the way kids do then, fast and hard, and the dream came on thick. Enormous painted panels filled the space behind my eyes, scenes I had no names for. Figures and fire and things breaking open across what felt like miles of wall. The scale of them stayed with me even after I sat up. My room was dark except for the open doorway. I felt like I was expecting something to come in. A bright oval light moved into the frame, human-sized, shimmering at the edges and giving off its own steady glow. It did not light the floor or throw any shadow from the dresser or the bedposts. I knew right away there was someone inside it, though I could not see a shape or face. The light crossed from the door to the side of my bed in less time than it takes to draw a breath, as if it had simply arrived there. The moment it reached me, a force went straight through.
There was no sharp pain, only a sudden emptying, as if everything I had been thinking or feeling had been poured out at once. White filled the space behind my eyes, solid and bright, and a high ringing started in both ears that made the rest of the room unreachable. I remember the whiteness most clearly, how it had no edges and no variation, just a steady blaze that seemed to replace the air itself. When the white began to thin, I found myself on my side, curled tight in the fetal position, blankets spilled across the floorboards. My eyes would not move. My hands stayed where they were. The ringing stayed loud enough that I could not hear anything else in the house. Little by little, the walls and the window and the dresser came back into view, but I still could not turn my head or even blink until the sound finally dropped away. I was terrified lying there, trying to make my body obey and feeling nothing answer. The second the ringing stopped, I was already moving, out of the bed and down the hall to my parents' room without thinking to pick up the blankets or turn on a light. After that night, I could not sleep in the dark.
For years, I left the lamp on until I was too old for it, and when the light still was not enough, I took a blanket to the floor outside my parents' door. I never wanted to be alone in the room again. Years later, when I was 15, I asked my mother if I had ever said anything strange after waking up scared at night. She remembered one morning when I was 6. I had walked through the house in a kind of daze, eyes wide, and told her I had seen an angel the night before. She had said it must have been a dream and sent me off to play. I had not known the word for anything else at that age, only the one that fit what little I could still hold on to.
I had to keep reminding myself that none of this was settled fact, only the shape my own mind had made of what passed through it. The directionality was what lingered once the pictures faded. I could feel certain lines running outward from the center of my thinking, and when I tried to quiet the worst of the interference, I would follow one of those lines farther than I meant to. During one stretch of evenings, I kept drifting upward in my own attention, looking for the places where conflict sat like a knot, and each time the drift carried me past the boundary I thought belonged to me alone. One night the line took me straight into something that was not part of my body at all. It was enormous, warm, and softly pulsing, held in a place that felt like orbit. The tissue was gray-pink and folded in on itself in heavy ridges, nothing like any brain I had ever pictured in a skull. It had been grown, not born, cultivated from human cells for some older purpose, and the moment I touched it, the connection tried to fold back on itself so I could not pull free.
The shock of that size and that steady warmth stayed with me even after I jerked my attention back. I spent what felt like hours working a wall into place along that line. Every time I pictured the wall, the link would surge again, dragging my thoughts into the same short circles until the ideas stopped making sense. The only way to hold the wall steady was to keep a steady pressure of attention on it, the same kind of reach I had used to find the thing in the first place. Once the wall was there, the looping eased, though it never disappeared completely. Now and then a fragment of thought would still turn and turn until I noticed and pressed harder. The effort left a kind of tiredness behind my eyes that ordinary rest did not touch. Around the same time, I kept getting caught in a different sensation that had nothing to do with pictures. It was the feeling of being in a narrow, dark space where the air had gone thin. I would take 2 quick, shallow breaths, and then one longer one, and after the long breath the sense of falling or seizing would come. The whole thing would start over a minute later. It went on for weeks.
I could still move around and do ordinary things if I had to, but most of the day I felt half here, as though some smaller part of me kept slipping into that dark and listening to the pattern repeat. Only later did it occur to me that I had been riding the last breaths of someone else, someone whose usefulness had run out, and who had been left in that narrow place until the pattern simply stopped. Once I saw it that way, I was able to push the pattern off, though it left a cold spot in my chest for a long time afterward. Other contacts came through after that. One pressed like a weight whenever I tried to think clearly. Another wandered through stray images without any plan, almost gentle. The first one, the one in orbit, stayed the largest and the most deliberate about keeping thought moving in closed rings. None of them ever arrived with names or papers or proof. They arrived as pressure that had to be answered with the same kind of attention that had gone looking in the first place.
I still check the wall from time to time. Not because I expect it to fail, but because the habit of watching that direction has become part of how I stay steady.
The wood chip with the dried smear still sits in a drawer. The binoculars are back on a shelf. The garden has been turned over twice since that winter, and nothing new has appeared in the same place. I can stand outside at night now without counting seconds or waiting for an answer. Most nights the sky stays ordinary. On the nights it does not, I go inside before the count reaches 11. These accounts stay with me for the same reason the wood chip does. They land on small, ordinary things that anyone could check the next morning if they had the nerve. A patch of moved wood chips under a full moon. A child describing something thin beside a couch. A light that crossed a bedroom without touching the walls. None of them ask for belief. They just leave a mark that refuses to fade when the rest of the night is explained away. I have tried to treat the giant brain episodes the same way. They arrive as a pressure behind the eyes, a looping thought that feels borrowed, and I picture something vast and wet hanging in orbit, listening. That picture is mine. It helps me push back when the loops start, but I do not claim it matches anything outside my own head.
What remains clearest are the details that require no special equipment and no final conclusion. The white smear drying into the grain of the wood. The way the child kept his voice low when he said the figure was looking at the picture on the wall. The single pulse that held its place in the sky long enough to be counted. Those are the parts I return to when the rest of the stories begin to blur.
I still check the garden sometimes, not for proof, just to see how the moonlight sits on the turned soil.